Buenas noches, good evening, bon nuit. I'm Malta Moreno Vega, President and Director of Creative Justice Initiative. Welcome. I'm very excited this evening because we have a series of artist guests from throughout the Caribbean, and we're focused on a discussion around a book authored by Sasha Dees. And it was very interesting because Sasha and I have been trying to do projects together probably for over 30 years. And her book has brought us together to, in fact, have a discussion, get together, reconnect, and share our discussion with an audience. So thank you for being with us. The book is titled Entangled Species Conversations on Contemporary Art in the Caribbean. And the roundtable discussion includes the artists that she will introduce. So I leave you with Sasha Dees, artist, curator, global trotter, and researcher. Sasha, welcome. Thank you
Thank
for being
you.
with us.
Well, I'm not an artist. Let me start with that. Definitely not. That would be too much. I think the writing the book was as creative as I probably become.
And as you
Mostly,
produce concerts with people and musicians,
yeah. So
a
it's more like
curator for sure.
yeah. I'm facilitating artist is how I always call it. It's sort of
Okay.
making things happen for people who create and try to get to get that done. And that goes from I don't know, making the coffee for them and finding the money and finding venues and all of that.
Well, that's
And
creativity for sure. So
yeah,
thank you for
yeah.
doing it.
I think first I'll introduce who the artists are that are
Yeah.
joining us from the Caribbean. We have Simon Tatham from Cayman Islands, and Sharali Emanuelson from Curacao, Onika Russell from Jamaica, Nelson Gonzalez from Aruba, and we're supposed to have Christopher Coget from Trinidad, but he didn't check in yet, I think. I don't see him. So he probably pops up later. So these would be all the people joining us for the roundtable.
Well, we're imagining that we're in a living room with a glass of wine or a cup of tea and something to munch on. And we know that this will happen in the future, but for now, we're imagining it. So it's an honor to meet you all. And thank you so much for participating in this discussion. When Sasha sent me the book, I was intrigued, one, by the title. So I want to ask her why the title and also why the book, right?
Yeah.
So let's start with why the title.
The title was because I think I do feel that everybody in the world is very entangled with each other on very levels as people, but also with nature. Um, so I had a discussion actually with Sharali why she wasn't. She asked me why not entangled humans, but I said we're also entangled with nature. So this is why species, and it was sort of also a riff on I like Christopher Coget's series Entangled Creatures. Um, and so I think that sort of reminded it of for me as well. And then of course there's the undertitle Conversations on Contemporary Art. I thought it's important to highlight that I had all these conversations so that it's a multifocal book and it's not just me sort of, going on and on and on about what I think it should be or something.
Well, it's definitely a guide, right? And a way of looking into the Caribbean with the
Yeah,
conversations you have had in your
yeah,
travels. So that is, and then the glossary in the back and the information that you share is very
yeah,
important. Why the Caribbean, right? You're in
yeah.
Holland right now. You're in the Netherlands. Why the Caribbean?
Um, I have a long history with the Caribbean. The first time I went was about 30 years ago with, yeah, like a friend. And so I went as a girl, like, I don't think I was even 20 when I went to Curacao. And that was just vacation, sort of going there, thinking that I kind of wanted to leave Holland and go somewhere else. And I went with her to her parents, her and her sister. So that was the first time. And I had like a total culture shock because I kind of went there thinking, oh, and then maybe if I like it, I'll just stay. And I just was all of a sudden exposed to this very different culture, different way, different lifestyle. Um, 30 years ago in Curacao, it was not so normal for, somebody who's like 19 to all of a sudden go and live by herself as a girl in Curacao, for instance. And I just realized, like, I hadn't thought about that. I wasn't going there to all of a sudden start a feminist movement that women could live by themselves too or something. So I was shocked by all these things and I just went back. But I was also intrigued, and I had all these friends that came from the Caribbean, from Suriname, from Curacao. I come from a family who's a colonizing family so I had was family that went to Suriname and to Curacao, Indonesia. Um, so it was kind of part of my life, but in a very strange way. I was always curious, like, yeah, but how would it be? So I started working with artists in my circle of friends who came from the Caribbean, and that's kind of how it started. So it was with music, which is how I met you, Marta.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Um, I just sort of started organizing trips for them, and then like it was also logical to go back to the countries they came from, or one of the first ones is I went to Jamaica to the Ocho Rios Jazz Festival with the band that I actually talked with you about.
Mm-hmm.
And so from one thing came another. I started in music, and then musicians composed music for theater, and I started organizing theater. And then somebody told me, "Are you the producer?" And I kind of learned that that's it. That is what the term is. So apparently, I now was a producer of theater, and it was very interdisciplinary. And I worked with artists on stage, and so I started. It was very organic. So I didn't study. I just sort of did the work in a
So,
way.
what was the objective in doing the book? What was the purpose, and do
So
you feel
overall,
that
these
you accomplished it?
yeah, over all these years, I realized like people don't know about each other. We don't know about the Caribbean. When I lived in New York, people don't know about the Caribbean. People in the Caribbean don't know about the other Caribbean people. And people would, like, everybody would also talk about that. Like, people like Chris or Tirso Marta in Curacao would say, like, it would be so great if somebody had the time to just sort of map out everything, like what what is there on all these islands, who is there, and that never happened because nobody has the time to do it or the money to do it, etc. So it was a conversation throughout. And then so I lived in New York for 20 years, on between New York and Amsterdam, and I was kind of bored with New York. I wanted to leave, but I didn't really know what to do. And then somebody at the Mondriaan Fund, which is the National Art Fund in Holland, asked me why I had never applied for any grant. And I'm not attached to a museum, and I never make exhibitions in a museum. So I said, I've never seen anybody like me who does all these various things getting a grant. So I never did it. And so she said the policies has changed. I should come and have a conversation. And I did. And in that conversation, they kept talking about my work in the Caribbean. So they can, of course, not tell you like, oh, you should do a project like that. But all
Mm.
of a sudden, it sort of clicked in my head. I thought it seems they are interested in people doing work in the Caribbean. Um, there has always been this question, like nobody knows of each other, nobody has the money and time to do it. Maybe this would be that project for me to just try to travel. And so I applied and I got money to go to 8 countries for 8 months. And then I started traveling and I got a lot of support. And in the end, it's how I could stretch the money. And I ended up traveling to 15 countries for like 16 months.
Well, the
And
book
that's
brings
kind of
up
how the book came. Mm.
the book brings up several issues, which I'm glad that you bring forward, because these are things that I think, as an institution builder in New York City, as well as here in Puerto Rico, one knows white privilege, right? And the ability of somebody to come to you and say, "I want to give you
Yeah.
money." That doesn't often happen to us, right? That doesn't often.
Yeah.
I don't think it ever happens to us. So,
Well, they said
uh,
you can apply. They didn't necessarily said like I want to give you money. Let's be clear about that too. If I would have sent in a really bad application, I'm sure they wouldn't have given it to me.
yeah, but there's a certain, and not in any way trying to be offensive to you, but
No,
there
no,
is a
no.
way that and you mention it in your book, that
Yeah,
white
yeah,
privilege does work,
yeah.
right?
No, it does.
And because we are in colonial countries and still in possession, Puerto Rico still a possession of the United States, right? There's certain ways of seeing, and there's certain ways of behaving, and there's certain ways of giving grants that
Yeah,
have to do, right, with that vision of white supremacy in some way, and whiteness in some way. So
yeah,
that you open it in your book, which is very brave of you, and I thank you, because Nelson started talking about it, in terms of the isolation that colonization has created, right?
yeah,
We're in close proximity, and it costs us more to travel and see each other than someone from Europe or someone from the United States,
yeah,
right? So that, you bring this up very clearly in your book. And that's very important. What happens
yeah.
as Caribbeans, as being in spaces, how do we address the issues that you bring up in your book so bravely? So, please,
Yeah.
it's open for
No, it's true,
discussion.
and there's also I guess the opportunity, right? Because I mean, I met the grant maker from the fund, for instance, at an opening here in Holland, and then we started talking, and that's when she brought it up. And I've said that on like because the Dutch islands all can apply at the same fund, so in theory, Sharali could have made that application, and you know, she could have done it. Um, but of course, she's then in Curacao and she never met this grandmaker because, of course, this grandmaker is running around here in Holland and I'm sometimes running around in Holland. So the opportunity to meet those people is, I have that opportunity and others don't. So you sort of, you befriend people from foundations more easily. And when you're away from it all, it is this institution far away in another country. So it becomes less approachable also. So that makes it harder. I think maybe Sharali can elaborate on that. It's I think because certainly now the past 5 years it has changed because before it was not the case, but now all the applications I can do, anybody on Aruba, Nelson can have all the same grants that I have, Sharali can have all the same grants that I have. But like I
Yeah,
said, the opportunity to make the connection with all these foundations is of course less, but I think they can probably maybe elaborate a little bit on that, how that
I
works.
really want to add something because the perspective from the Dutch Caribbean is very complex. So, and completely agree with Sasha comments about the possibility with Shareli from Curacao. I'm from Aruba, and one independent initiative from Ceiba, a real small island in the Caribbean, have the same accessibility with Sasha have, in Amsterdam South. So after being working 12 years about Inburgering art and art as Inburgering. Inburgering, knowing this word, original word in Dutch, is integration. The integration is the Inburgering as an integration concept translated in English is all the cultural procedures with a immigrant have to pass through to get the Dutch rights after being after living in the Dutch Caribbean for any amount of years, being married, or get any legal status. So, as a Venezuelan artist, reaching in Aruba after 20 years of life, because half of my career happens in Aruba already, I discovered these white privileges as a Venezuelan immigrant in Aruba and raise all the opportunities for me and make opportunities to present my work in South Korea and the Dominican Republic and the US. So I think we have to talk about insulation, but also talk about the infrastructure existing already to make projects possible like this book. And I stand very strong on this because I heard in Prince Bernhard Culture Funds for 20 years supporting cultural projects in the Dutch Caribbean. And also the funds VKBV before Mondrian funds helped me when I was recently an immigrant artist. So I think this is a possibility to open new discussions about this infrastructure system and bring solution for our insulation and standing more for the integration of the Caribbean and forgetting actually colonialism processes and colors is about art and is about expression and also the new virtualization of patrimony we're trying to raise through this conversation. We're raising cultural patrimonies, virtual patrimonies through this conversation, and this is a perfect opportunity to talk about that.
Yeah, I think what I did notice is there's such a huge difference between the islands, because of course Onika has way less possibilities than Nelson and Sharali have, or Marta has in Puerto Rico, for instance. Because like there is still there's still the funds in the U.S. Not even to mention if you're in Haiti or Dominican Republic, there is not there are
None.
no funding. Are no funding possibilities. So it already sort of makes for an equality in one region, and that all links to still to the colonization, of course, because I mean, otherwise you wouldn't have those possibilities to get the money in those countries that are richer.
I think
And I
that's
don't
very
really know
important.
how you can solve that. I mean, that like we talked about yesterday, Onika was one of the residents for the Davidoff Art Initiative, for instance, but she was the last one. So there is a great initiative,
Mhm.
money actually for the region. So it meant everybody, regardless from what island, could actually apply, which was great. But then after 5, 6 years, it's gone. So there's a lot of temporality in those kind of opportunities, I think.
Yeah, I was gonna comment, Sasha, that actual point about the Mondrian being, of course, always having some issues wherever, but in terms of when you look at in the English-speaking Caribbean, we have I think British Council, which has been really inconsistent,
Yeah.
and we don't even have a regular grant structure. So I feel like we probably need to have a like group think that to level this inequality is which islands have this access. Maybe French speaking through Institut Francais and Mondrian Dutch speaking. I don't know, but maybe we need to collaborate more across islands so we partner so that English speaking can level with the rest. Yeah.
Yeah, if for me, I mean, um, let me start by saying that when I started my art education, I so for most cases, most of us, when we finish school and we want to study for a profession, we go abroad to do so. And
Mm-hmm.
that's also within the arts. But the amount of people that actually choose to do so, or to choose for a career in the arts or in culture, is very small, because that is a very high risk undertaking. If you think of investment, if you think of if you want to earn a living afterwards, and also this idea of creativity being granted to our cultures for like for as a natural source. So that is not, that is gifted, and that's it, no. So I think by making that choice, it's you have to constantly know for yourself and remind yourself why you're doing this. So there is a particular strength that you have to or a force that you have to also fight against from early on. And that is not even to talk about the structure, because I think that is additional. But it starts with, okay, which environment are you in, and in the moment that you choose to do this as a profession, which the infrastructure really demands from you, as well. So when you decide to do so and you enter in a space, it's usually a space in a different country where you have to undertake a different culture and a different attitude towards life. And in doing so, you kind of have, yeah, I think for several, for me, it was really noticing that I had to step away from where I'm from. So being in the Netherlands and studying in the Netherlands, there was a period where I remember professors really asking me, but why are you commenting in my work? Why am I commenting on certain subject matters, while actually you could go down the street and do this? But I really, from early on, I was like, no, but I'm interested to making this work and talk about this matter, which is also there. I just have to go to another city because there is a community there that I can recognize and identify with. And that friction, or that force, not only
Mm-hmm.
knowing that I have for myself to create a particular space, I I I understood very early on that I have to make things for myself. That it wasn't going to be easy, because I mean most things are not easy. Or in my case, I know I had to work for it. And once I understood that, it wasn't about expecting people to do things for me, expecting for some place, because I'm actually, when I speak like that, I'm a very shy person. So it's not like I will barge in. It's because I know these faces, I'm very even comfortable, and we're in a living room. So
Yes, yeah.
that makes it comfortable. But I'm very shy. So to demand something from an infrastructure in a foreign country, wh- where do I start with that? So it was really, okay, what I can do is see and understand the system as such, and see what I can do. My first encounter in the Netherlands was with wanting to meet other artists in the Dutch Caribbean, because I understood, okay, so if we're a small group, then if I find all the ones that are busy with it, then we can get together and make something
Mm-hmm.
out of it. And that's how, for instance, Uni Artist started. And my first conversations with Mondrian were unsuccessful. Now, looking back, it was 13, 14 years ago, uh, um, where, I'm knocking and asking how things are, but at that time it is a different time. It's not only because of our colonial legacy, it also has to do with maturity of the organization. It also has to do with the staff who is there working at that moment. In particular, what is the, maybe the personal interest or development. So in that space, I understood, okay, so maybe it's not about getting the funding, but it is very much about understanding the system. And another point, and of course this is a long story, but that is one part, and fighting the force. And the other one is the insecurity, and the information circulation. There is a proper insecurity of being small or coming from a small place and knowing if you count or not. And it's really about knowing that there is a possibility, like now this book. And I'm very grateful how, this information, and such has always been very open in sharing, and also
Mm-hmm.
encouraging me in my career, like, you should, and that is something that it it can happen once you understand that there are these possibilities and you get the information. But because it's far away, because again, certain timing and maturity of certain context, the information wasn't flowing. So even Onika, like Onika mentions, like for instance, in Jamaica, there is less opportunity. It's only now that the funding, Mondrian, for instance, are putting our island names on their websites that we can specifically apply. Because before that, that wasn't happening. But the inconsistency of the funding when we're here, it's also inconsistent. So all the steps that I had to undertake is understanding the language, creating an own network, really learning economics, basically as an artist, and doing all these things to apply. So it just demands this incredible force that I'm wondering how long it takes, but that yeah, now but that's
Woo!
my first yeah contribution.
Well,
Yeah.
I think that being born in New York, right, in El Barrio, in a community, let's say probably that you went to, fine, right, when you were out of your country. I mean, our parents created a neighborhood, right, El Barrio, and there was a certain aesthetic. There was a certain way that we ate, that we heard music, that we understood our lifestyle, and we were in New York, and going out of our barrio or our community, right, into the broader community, we understood, or we didn't understand, there's a different way of seeing the world. There's a different way of understanding culture. There's a different way of perceiving color, right? There's a different way of understanding what is valued. And I think that, that's what you were addressing. Because I remember being in class and the professor said, paint a still life. So I did. I went home and I did, the requirements. But in my house, there were mangos, there were plátanos, there were all of these things. And when I come to class, everybody has flowers and vases, right?
Yeah.
And that was not in my house. My still life was totally different. And the professor basically said, that's too colorful, that's too busy, right? And it took me a long time to understand that it was a different aesthetic, it was a different context, it was a different cultural, educational, informational process that I had gone through that others outside of my community had not. So the question is, whose eyes, whose perception, whose understanding of their culture and what nurtures you, right, gives you your expression and gives you your creativity or your information base, right? And I think that that's one of the things that we were fighting when we started building our institutions out of the Black arts movement, the Chicano movement, the Native American movement, right? We were saying, like, we have a different way of seeing, we have a different history, a different legacy, and the aesthetic reflects that. And I think that's also what Nelson was addressing, coming from Venezuela, right, into his new home. So that I think that that's part of the conversation as well. Do you stick to what people understand and see, or do we bring what we understand and see? And is it seen as valuable and as important and as part of historical and global aesthetics?
Yeah. I also wanted to add, I think a big part that I read from the book is it reveals some of the difficulties, but it also reveals a tremendous amount of progress, I think, as well for the region. I think especially in the last 10 years or so, there's been maybe not a unified movement, but lots of initiatives that have done a great deal. I've given, I think, artists of my generation, a great deal of help that wasn't there before. And I've been lucky enough to benefit from several of those initiatives, some of them being things like Tilting Access, which are, a sort of joint conference with institutions and curators and museums, and then Caribbean Linked, which brings together young artists and curators together as well. That's an initiative that takes place in Aruba. And that was really my introduction to the Caribbean conversation. Like Shirley was saying earlier, depending on what island you're from, if you're going to take on a formal education in the arts, you have to leave the island to pursue it more.
Mm.
And so with the Cayman Islands, my options were either to go to the UK or the US, and I went to the US. But I wasn't really involved at all with what was happening in the Caribbean scene until maybe a couple years into the program, when I was encouraged by a professor actually to look into it. Someone that was familiar with artists that were doing a lot in the American scene that had, Caribbean backgrounds. And it was from there that I started looking into it. And then, a year after that, the Caribbean Linked Initiative was happening, and I was lucky enough to be invited to that. And that just kind of opened up the whole region to me and understanding a lot more about what's going on. And I really applaud artists from the older generation, people like Annalie Davis, Chris Cozier, Elvis Lopez, who have kind of really made initiatives, or Tears of Marta, who have made initiatives to kind of help the next generation get a step up the ladder that they didn't get. And I think Sasha's book adds that as well to all these smaller initiatives that are happening. Her book kind of reveals in a certain way all the different small efforts and how they're all, as the book title says, entangled in different ways, and everybody is related in some way or another. And being able, I think that was the thing that impressed me the most about the book, was being able to look at all these separate things from a sort of outsider perspective, and being able to see them through Sasha's eyes and evaluate them was really, really helpful. And it's just another thing that adds to these initiatives that have already been started.
I wanted to add to your point, Simon, that really, as an example of, you talked about Caribbean Linked, and that's where I met you, and I guess legacy linked to Charlie. But I think that that example has really shown that you can take what you have, whatever it is. Like for me, I was teaching, no grants, no anything, but I had a camera, and that's enough to do something because the internet is free. And then you start from there. But it's the example, right? It's seeing that, well, for me locally, NLS Kingston was really important, because I saw that what Deborah Anzinga had was a garage, and that's it. And so she made this thing, which is now a gallery space, just little by little. But the other thing for me that was really important in Sasha's book, because even I didn't realize this about Jamaica and the rest of the Caribbean, is like the cost of an arts education, or like the pricing of work, which, we all have our own system. But I think it's like, I think the most important thing to see transparently, plainly, because galleries won't even share that with you, right? But for you to have that, and you can go into a classroom, as I teach, and say to a student, this is what you should be looking at, because here is a text that says it. So even though I could have kind of given some information before, to know that, okay, Jamaica has the most expensive arts education, and there are other options here. I found that really useful to see like numbers and costs on things, which, in the islands, people do keep mom's word about things.
No.
Yeah, and there is a lot of questions while I was traveling, like around all of that. Like I would have my questions that initially I thought would be, important for the book. Or I also, while I was traveling, I wrote all these articles for Trendbeheer. And I noticed, like, there's all these things that people just don't know, like, pricing of the work, or like all these simple things that I thought, oh, that's just helpful. And so also in the book, I thought, okay, that's why I recommend all these books. Also, like if I talk about the economy of art, there's all these books that you can maybe buy or loan from the library, that gives you more. I mean, I wasn't gonna rewrite all of those, but there are all these helpful books that you can actually read and get a lot of information from. And it's the same with funding. If you don't know where to go, or what is important, or how would it be viewed, there are whole books about it, but I figured at least I can give, the 20 tips that kind of, guide you to go somewhere. So yeah, I hope that is helpful. There is not a lot of transparency, which I think, and I don't know why not, because I mean, what is it gonna bring? I've always thought that. I'm like, okay, so I have, for instance, all these addresses that I shared with all of you. I could have not done it, but I mean, it's not as if that gives me anything to not give it to you, and it's not making a difference. It is making a huge difference if I give it to you. So why wouldn't I do that? It's an email, but people just don't do it, which is interesting. I find like the sharing of information should be done more, of the experience. This is how I did it, to think about it, and then maybe look at your own context and think, well, okay, that wouldn't work here, but this would maybe work here. And so, because everybody starts all over again and again, while you can learn from each other. So NLS, for instance, is a good example of, there was a beta locale and there was a Alice Yard that Deborah could also link up with and learn from, which is helpful. What Simon was saying, like I think now there is more and more of the sharing the knowledge. I think because of the connection, and you can go there. But yeah, it's not, and it's often not documented. So I try to put as much as I could in the book, I think. There was also, Sharali has read while I was writing. She was reading with me, one of the people reading with me. So I could also get feedback from her, like, oh, what would be helpful for you if or what would have helped you earlier on, and then I can maybe put that in there.
Yeah.
No, and I think there is not only in Marta, when I hear you speak, and it resonates in the sense that there is a whole diasporic community, from the Caribbean, in the States, in the UK, and also in Europe, which is then again also a different set of experiences, no, that they are undergoing, even in thinking of what is possible. One of the things that surprised me is to see myself back in, such as in the book, in several chapters in these conversations, of seeing myself back, like, oh, I am not alone in this, like, and whatever I'm trying to do, there are other people out there, and that small number that I'm looking for, and innocently I started looking in the Dutch Caribbean. That number also exists, though that small number of artists also exists in all these islands. But also more, these initiatives were not only good for us, but there are different level of maturities as well. So Onika, I'm always amazed of how many artists are in Jamaica, or the work that Annalie and Holly has done before. So, and Chris, like, I mean, there is different level. Maybe we got the funding, like we not, but I mean Dutch institutions, but the level of maturity that I was looking for and wanted to have for myself, I mean, I could see that reflecting back in Trinidad. I could see that back in Santo Domingo. I could see that in Cuba. And then I'm like, but I want that level. I want that attention on process. I would like those type of conversation and understanding of our history, and unpacking and undoing, which it's difficult. Maybe if I speak, I mean, Nelson, maybe you can second me. I mean, certain conversations on the Dutch Caribbean islands, in that extent, I went looking for that, and my thirst came in the region. And my getting understanding, I knew that in Europe or in US you had a diasporic community, so you have, in the European setting, you have people from everywhere in the world that their parents are from Jamaica, but that direct me from the Caribbean, understanding that there is right there, I have neighbors and we have loads in common, and that we can within our niche interest, because we are a very small niche, we can engage with each other on a different level, on a more deeper level. That started with soca music in Europe and not here.
Yeah,
That
Mm.
yeah.
started with
I
Caribbean with Caribbean linked on Aruba. Because of yeah.
I have to add a few things, and I bring different comparisons and similarities and disjointed ideas about the Caribbean. But let's talk at the example of Cuba. Cuba is a very controlled country, politically talking. Cuba have no free economy. Cuba don't have any European dependency to make subsidies. But let's talk about the high level of quality of the contemporary art in Cuba. Well, in this point, we don't talk about funding only. We're talking about contingencies, cultural contingencies, allow to bring in us different motivations to produce high quality of art. So let's talk about artists like Adoni Ferro from Havana. So with a level of infrastructure, self-produced. So different contexts have different heritage. If I don't know if my artistic production will be the same if I was a born and raised Dutch Caribbean artist, or my inburgering process and find my place in the Dutch Caribbean is my Venezuelan heritage of live and contingencies. So we need to be fair in the way to make measurements and proportion of situations. No, so the contribution of the Trinidadian Carnival in our culture in Aruba is high valuable. The contribution of the all speaking English Caribbean people with come to raise the economy in Aruba in the 20s is very important to add as a symbolic value to be in a different way to make proportions about us. Sorry, I still short in English, but I hope my idea is very clear. But it's about the cultural context, about the contingencies, local contingencies, and also the way to be creative and learn how to adapt ourselves in different contexts. So if I'm artist and I make any type of bread, any type of and I want to sell it on the street, I'm completely sure in Jamaica or in Trinidad, I just set up a table in front of my house and I can sell the bread. Here in Aruba, being a Dutch colony, I need a permit to have a table outside to just sell
Mhm.
stupid bread, to make a stupid income, to have paper to make a drawing, and hope if someone can buy it for me in the international market because I'm an artist in the biennale circulation and international scenes. So maybe the amount of people living in Trinidad and Tobago can make a new number of collectors compared with rich people in Aruba, and it's about cultural level. So, where's the topic? The topic is where we come from of the accessibility we have.
Yeah.
So that's a good question.
Yeah. I Yeah, absolutely. And I think the book helps with that, with helping evaluate what are the different things that the different islands do have as resources, like with Cuba and with Jamaica too. Even though Jamaica's pricing for their art education might be expensive, at least there is higher education in the arts there. And there's no denying that there are not amazing artists on the scene who have come from Enla Manley and who have come from, Isa in Havana. So I mean that I think evaluating that is good. And I I think one of the things that I like a lot about Sasha's book is that it helps me realize what are the sort of privileges that I have from my background in Cayman. And it might not be art education, but Cayman has a great art museum. And that was my introduction as well to the arts, was doing internships and work studies within the museums, because there is no formal art education, really, any programs higher than high school level in Cayman. Understanding that Cayman has that, and that's its sort of privilege compared to other institutions, but other islands. But other islands have education resources or funding resources. I think the book did a good job with revealing that, and also to me showing that there are a lot of things to tap into within the region. I joked with Sasha a few days ago before we had this conversation that when I was reading the chapter about higher education and the arts in the book, that was my favorite chapter. And there was an artist that she knew that I think was from San Juan, Sasha, and ended up asking about how they could go to ISA in Cuba to do the program there, how they could pay for it, and what arrangements. They investigated what arrangements could be made. And I thought that was so funny, because as I'm reading it, I think to myself, my gosh, I wouldn't even have thought about that. You could actually go and ask, or you could investigate into that. And it's a funny thing, because all the time you have this sort of stereotype in your mind that in order to get access to resources, you have to leave the region and then come back, and then leave the region and then come back. But there are so many things that are working well here as well that we overlook all the time, or maybe we just assume that it's too difficult to get a foot in the door. So I like the book because of that, because it reminds me again and again what is there.
That's true, Simon. When you talk about Edna Manley, and I go back to Martha's story about doing the still life, and I was thinking, when you study outside of the region, it is a privilege in a big way, because you do get access to this market, and understanding that if you study inside the Caribbean, you just don't have that same understanding. Hi, Chris. But the fact that we get to paint still lifes, where we encourage to paint mangoes, where we become really
Exactly.
great at painting mangoes. We paint all kind of Caribbean things around. So that is a privilege. But it's interesting that Chris just appeared, because I was really interested, for me, in one of the comments in the book where he went to the Basel Art Fair and said, I'm not sure I want to be a part of this, if or something like this. But I wrote a note to myself, because I remember I was really lucky and fortunate to receive the last David Off Arts Initiative residency to New York. But one of the things it really did for me was like shock, because I suddenly understood, well, this is the art world that's like the centered art world. I'm not so sure I'm that interested in this center, because the performances, which is what I would call it, the performances and the sacrifices and the kind of way that you socialize, and just the economy and the way it's set up, it was not authentic to what my understanding of what my art practice was. And so it was really a kind of wake up. And so I really resonated with Chris's words, that like the way you can really see it and think, question, is this what I want to do? But it's good, because what it means is that it reaffirms, okay, so when I come back, I'm adding this, I am helping to inform those who are here that I work with, let's say through Tide Rising art projects. But I can say, okay, in New York this happens, but I'm really interested in informing for here as well. And there's another artist, a couple of artists, Philip Thomas and Camille Cheddar, I know, who started Resume the Struggle exhibitions in Kingston, just for that purpose, where they're really interested in having the exhibitions in Kingston, so that the economy starts there. Yeah.
Well, we're talking about different things. This is the only 1% of the Caribbean artists, and they're only exception. when we confront ourselves with the art market in the mainstream cities and all these sceneries like Seoul, New York, and Berlin, is completely unreal. But we have to make a clear segmentation about emergencies to be art, contemporary artists in the Caribbean, how we can create our venues and our markets, and how we can be part of two systems, is living in between two waters. Because the problem of all these surprises is the appreciation we have for this type of sceneries, of this type of economies, in contemporary arts. I don't sell nothing as a contemporary artist. So I don't even sell a piece of paper. So because the art that I produce is not truthful for the collectors, because it's not a consistency idea. It's not a similar in one collection to others. But this is a completely different topic. In the Caribbean, if we compare ourselves with New York, Berlin, we stay with the same colonialism history, and we have to be busy just creating our own economy, and this marginalizing the physical things and being virtual and be present in all these sceneries too, because keeping in the surprise don't help. And the situation in Curacao is similar. I don't know, maybe 2 3 artists have a market, a solid market in Curacao. In Aruba, none. Not in the contemporary art field. We don't have modern art. Pintores, escultores, we don't have that because we don't have a school. So we have a gap in the historical production of art, with the painters, the sculpture, the graphic artists don't exist in the history of art in Aruba. So we jump from the traditional painting to the contemporary art. So the vision, of, for example, of Caribbean Link, or the vision of my exhibition in other museums around the Caribbean, is just a spectrum. It's just a spectrum of the cultural, and it's not even market. So we have to talk not only about being surprises of this scenery, but how we can create our economy and art. So somebody have a suggestion about that? Because I think this is the level of dialogue. Brennan suggestions. So I was reflecting in a piece of the book. So I said, when I see the situation in the art fairs in Puerto Rico, I said the problem is we don't create our art fairs in New York. We have to create our art fairs in New York.
I
So
if, yeah, for hearing you, Nelson, I think for me, I don't know if I want to nuance the thing when we say there isn't any like painters or graphic. Like I think we all think that we're doing such a good job. We are, or there are several again levels of um engagement that are taking place because there is a lot of talent. I mean, if we look, I mean, that's one of the things, Sasha, we spoke about where you were busy with the book. If you look at the sizes of the islands and the amount of talent there is, and I think the problem is that how do you get to, is there time and will people take the time or are they able to dedicate the particular time to reach a particular growth or reach a particular full potential? When you say, Nelson, that we should, that's what we should be talking, or the market, and we should go to New York, I say yeah, but not only that, because if I look at the chapters of the book and think of what Onika said, that Chris, you questioned, do I want this? Not all artists indeed needs to go to biennials or needs to go to a museum, but it's the point, like you just mentioned also in the beginning, that table in front, some people are not reaching their maximum potential, their artistry, because they cannot put even the table in front, right? But yet others need and want to go to the biennial and have those type of conversations, while others have to stay. So you have, I think it's always looking at like if you want to when you shop or if you need a mentor, you kind of have a particular option and guide you in a particular road that you want to go to. And I was lucky to have indeed, as a newer generation, to have examples that I understood that Ella's yard, it's a yard. I mean, things can happen. We can have conversations in a yard. I don't need this idea of a fancy biennial to be successful. No, success. What gratifies me is more of an emphasis in process as opposed to sales. Well, even though I understand that that is relevant, and I do think that that market should exist, and we need to understand that much better.
I think
Um,
we're talking about the same. It's just make a difference in between our artistic production and the way to socialize ourselves and the way to be in these venues and sell
mm,
or create our own economy in these sectors. I don't believe in one thing. I
mm,
believe
mm,
in multiple things at the same time.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
what I do believe seriously is what happens in the interior of the communities. That's
mm,
why I create a platform to socialize artistic production in the Dutch Caribbean and connect it with other people and other cultural contexts. And that's why it's called Curaduría Malandra. Malandro is a thiefer, but also is the person which can make new ways to make new alternative and possibilities to actually breaking the law, make possible things. So Curaduría Malandra is just do it in virtual, simple blogging, but full of contents and working close with different artists and crossover ideas, disciplines, and many things just to dismarginalize what we producing in our communities and don't think in only in Aruba as a context because the Pran project present artists from Curacao, from Guatemala, from the Dominican Republic, and make bridges with actually is the opportunity to make other visibles and see visible to do.
I
So
think
I
that
believe
the
in everything.
important the important is to see what's happening in each of our spaces, right? And not only the spaces within the Caribbean, which the book addresses, right, but fleetingly talks about the states, right? There has been various movement in the states that some would say have pushed the conversation forward. Some have said not, but the Black Arts Movement was part of that. Right now, we can't look away from the sacrifice of George Floyd. People are being hired by museums that were never looked at, right? People that represent African Americans, Afro Caribbeans, Afro Latinos, Latino, Latinx, and so on and so forth. So I think the question is, for me, right? When we built our own institutions, we were saying our aesthetic, the way we see, the way we perform, the way that we manifest our art has its own aesthetic grounded in the legacy and the history of who we are, right? Which is part of the Renaissance movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and so on and so forth. There are other movements that are very conservative and want to be part of being in institutions that have negated and devalued us historically and feel it an accomplishment that now they have a curator job in spaces that didn't have you, right? So that the question is, what is it that we value? What is it that we understand is of value? Because people that are getting recognized now were great 10 years ago, right? But now they're being recognized because of the Black Lives Matter movement, the Latinx movement. And we went through that during the Black Arts movement. So that all of a sudden you get recognized because there's a storm, there's a hurricane, right? Is that the way that value is defined? Is that the way we want it defined? So that I think there's a conversation that has to be more textured. And Chris, I didn't mean to cut you off. Hi, Amanda. How are you? Are you
Sorry,
joining us?
I think I'm here.
Oh, yes, you are. I hear you.
I have to apologize. I just ended up in a weird techno drama trying to get on. So
Well, I'm
a little
glad
bit,
you're on.
I'm a bit mentally confuffled. So I missed while you all were proceeding. I was there doing all kinds of weird techno things, passwords and all kinds. Then suddenly I got it. So I'm relieved to be here.
Well, we're
So
thankful that you're here.
I don't know, I'm listening. I think I just have to listen more to find that entry point. I suppose the entry point is what I said about the being in Basel some years ago. I mean, well, it's a kind of anthropology, right? I come from a small island in the Caribbean. Yes, I did go to art school in the US. Yes, I've traveled to various countries and had dialogues in various contexts. And I suppose the question I'm asking is, at this level of economy and social interaction, what do I feel any connection? Because maybe when I'm in my studio making my work, what do I imagine to be my community or what I'm speaking to? And that comes with a kind of an irony, because I think let's just be very honest. I mean, the Anglophone Caribbean is 6 million people, right? Trinidad is 1.3 or 4. So in a sense, one of the weird things about Caribbean practice is always pitched across geographies, because none of these spaces can really sustain practices of a certain level. So we come from a place where almost inherently the work is kind of pitched to a wider world than the immediate surroundings in which we are. And it may be stronger from an economic point of view, in the sense that, yes, there's a tremendous amount of connection, maybe you feel, or there's a dialogue or an argument you may feel in your respective location. Like I'm in Trinidad, I'm in Port of Spain, and there's a kind of conversation. And of course, I'm very curious about how that conversation, the trajectory of that conversation in the wider Caribbean. And I want to say that I don't really read the Caribbean as being about the islands exclusively. I mean, the Caribbean kind of ends or begins in Amsterdam or Paris or New York or Toronto. I mean, the Caribbean, in a sense, is wherever Caribbean people find themselves. And it's not so much that the Caribbean is a theme. It may just be a critical disposition coming from a certain historical experience. And that's what we share. I mean, I don't think there are any islands in the Caribbean that didn't have a history of slavery or indentureship or sugar, that kind of, that didn't face conquest and trade routes, military interventions or interventions of different kinds, media interventions, cocaine trading and financing interventions. So, we're all kind of in the same boat. But with all of that said, there's a kind of way that you can find that empathy and that dialogue at home, in the region, in the kind of wider diasporic net. And there's a potential economy there as well. But in some ways, we often find ourselves in others, like searching beyond that. Because as visual artists, sometimes that desire is being shaped by how you want to platform your work. I mean, it's really been an odd challenge for me, because I think if I was from Mexico, that wouldn't be a problem, in the sense that Mexico is a large society. I can have an economy, and or Brazil, I can have an economy and a critical conversation about my work and survive without ever really leaving, maybe going from one city to the next. But of course, I'm not saying that artists in those countries don't have a desire to platform their work in other circumstances, but in the Caribbean, it may be central to a certain kind of survival. I'm not sure there's such a thing. I mean, there's a local practice, but more times than not, that local practice is shaped by very local tastes, very local levels of investment that don't
Mhm.
not always positive, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying this is an absolute, but it's a very tricky game. So we are born into a very odd social condition that's very different, say, from an artist that, from the United States or Brazil, where there may be internal institutional structures, internal investments, internal mechanisms that can bring credibility and build your career.
Mm.
So in my own personal, I came from the US back to the Caribbean because I was trying to find something. I was looking for something from the place that I was from, trying to understand the value of the way I think coming from that experience. And it had to shift to a regional concern, and then by extension, it had to shift to a diasporic concern. Um, as the career and the vocabulary or the requirements changed.
Mm.
So when I got to Basel, in a sense, I said, no, this is somewhere in the middle of Europe, and I'm not thinking about these people when I'm making my work, and they're not thinking about me when they're thinking about investing in it, right? So the question is, why am I here? And you know,
Mm.
because years ago I had a real crisis, and I thought I'll go anywhere. In fact, when I first came back into the Caribbean, I did not return to the United States for 10 years. And I did most of my travel in the Caribbean and Latin America. I just wanted to have a different conversation. I want to understand myself and my work in a different location, not exclusively in the Euro-American narrative. Um, so I don't know if that's helping this conversation, because I feel very, very suspect jumping in at this tangent.
No, I think yeah, it's always good to have you, Chris. And no, I think the if I can add to that, that question also makes me think of Sasha, your role in like you were one of the people who are thinking broader, and you were genuinely interested, in understanding what was happening and why all of us in our own way were worried. And um I think it's important not only in the places and the value or wanting to go beyond, but I think what I wanted to comment on was also the people that we are investing in us, whether it is from the region or outside. I mean, I can imagine, for me, it makes much more sense for me as an artist to be in conversations with curators that are there is this genuine interest than rather than not, um, or that have an understanding or that have a particular link, and with that within a proper context, and not exoticizing for the sake of putting a region on the map as such, but invested in a particular area that I'm interested in, or I would be gathering with new perspectives. And s I think for me, through you, Sasha, I've encountered more people from also the other islands, and in reading, it just came back much more strongly. And it's through these individuals, so not a biennial, not it's true people, true actual people that are invested in their work, in their practice, that the force that gives you so much power. This book gives you, it's food. It has tremendous monetary
Mm.
value because you will reconsider your practice in a particular way that will help you maybe make certain choices that you would otherwise not, because of the flow of the information being stacked and gestagneerd. So it's not only the institutions, it's not only the space, like I mentioned, the art, but it's also the people that we encounter and our investment. in that we have to look in terms of value, because we started this conversation with funding. That was the first, uh, and of course that is very much necessary. But I think, yeah, and that going beyond. Chris, I had the same thing. I wanted to come back home. I wanted to understand home, and with home, I find a lot, and I'm still learning so much.
So, Sasha, in listening to the conversation, do you feel that your purpose in terms of writing the book has been addressed?
Yeah,
And
I
if
mean,
you were to write more,
I
what would it
just,
be?
I think what Shirley was saying is sort of what it was. I remember Chris also saying when I, when I was in Trinidad doing the research, even like what I was saying earlier, that you were mentioning like the conversations are important. So it became this multifocal book, which sort of then shows all the people, because I mean, even for myself personally, I always say, like, I might not have money, but my wealth is the people I know, and who help you and you help them. Like you go a long way. Like the money and therefore funding, to sort of circle back to the beginning, is not always the only way in achieving something. I mean, this book. And I said in another conversation, I mean, my name might be on it, but it's made by all of you and everybody that I met, and also over the years. That's what the book is, and so it's for you, by you, in a way. It's like what Simon was saying. Like I'm all of a sudden reading myself back, and that's what it is. Like sometimes when you may be depressed, you can read about yourself and think, oh, okay, well, yeah, maybe I'm not doing that bad. Let's continue then, or maybe, like somebody else in the region. And I think for me, also for the outside, I think it was meant for people. Yeah, I don't think my book is gonna convince a curator who wasn't interested in any of you that all of a sudden he's gonna be interested. But it hopefully the people who are interested, but always say, I don't know where to look, now know where to look, and they might, I don't know, like fly out to an island and invite people for exhibitions, and that's what I hope for, I guess, and find each other, and learn from each other, like what Shirali was saying and Simon was saying, like we can look to Chris and Elvis and Tirzo, etc.
I have a strange thought.
Mhm.
I haven't had enough time to spend with the book because I got my copy very late, and
Chris, it
so I've
hasn't
kind of
been checked. I didn't pick up the box yet, and it's still on customs. So
yeah. But I it's this is kind of anecdotal, but I remembered a couple of years when I was in art school and so on. There was a kind of standard text that you had to read. You know, it was what would say be. Um, and then one day I went to like a secondhand bookshop, and then I found a series of tiny books, and then I realized, ooh, because the person that was teaching sounded so profound. They had this book and they had the slides and they were talking and they were dropping all these quotes, but none of this information was in the actual book itself, right? The book just had the narrative, you know. But these other set of books had the quotes by the artists, quotes by the critics, private conversations, letters, documents. And when I read that, it shook me up. So there's a kind of one of my, and I kind of, I'm getting into the stuff, but I had a slightly different expectation for this book, I have to say. It's not my book, it's Sasha's book. But she said it's mine, so that's why I'm developing the arrogance to bring this to the table in a sense. But a lot of there's a kind of geography to production in the Caribbean, right? Because artists are moving from one island to the next, moving from the diaspora in and out of the region. And there's all these weird accidents. And one of the things, like, it's funny, one of the stories Sasha always told me is that she had traveled to Trinidad one of her first times, and she was in transit for a couple of hours. And she said she took a taxi or something to take her to a beach, and she's walking on this beach. And then coming the next way is a close friend of hers that she hadn't from Guyana, and she had met in Holland, who just happened to be walking by on the beach on that same day. And
and
so,
granted, at 6 o'clock in the morning.
Exactly, right?
So
now,
not like
why,
nobody's on the beach. 6 o'clock in the morning.
yes, and why that I think is important is that I remember getting an email from a friend of Sasha's who I had met working on a project in Suriname. And she's saying, "What are you doing hanging out with my friend there in New York? I haven't seen her in 2 years, and you are with Sasha, and I don't like it," right? I mean, this was a provocative, jocular comment. But what I'm trying to say is that Sasha's practice has been a kind of networking practice with a number of happy accidents. But happy as not just in, whimsically, happy in terms of the agency of what has, the connections and the dialogues that have come through that. And that's a very particular kind of practice. And I kind of I feel that the book needs a big footnote, right? Starting from that accidental meeting on Maracas, because there have been a number of accidents that then evolve into kind of ideas, projects, and strategies, and connections between artists. A simple telephone call. I mean, I think you should. A typical Sasha conversation is, or WhatsApp, but she's abandoned WhatsApp for some other spectrum, some other platform that I'm not going to go to. There's too many. It's a simple message. Chris, you are here. I think you should have a conversation with this person, right? And sometimes you do, and that turns into some fascinating interaction. So I use that term, the geography of production, because I think something that constitutes what is the Caribbean is mobility and people moving off site, off plantation, off nation, off rock. And in that space, which is you could say, water or river, it's fertile, and new interactions and new possibilities manifest. And so the little of the book I've gone through, there's a lot of informational stuff in there. And I have to say, I'm not necessarily I don't feel inclined to read that. I kind of wanted to go at the juicy stuff, which is the stuff that talks about, and it's almost as if the book needs a part 2 or a fat footnote section. I know it's not an academic book because I don't feel authentically capable of reading this book in a certain way, because when I'm reading, I'm hearing the secondary conversations, which I think a lot of people won't be privy to. And those secondary conversations, I don't know, out of formal discretion or publishers' pressure, but I kind of wish there was more of that stuff. But that stuff is the stuff that has brought us all together.
I try to get that in. I try to get that in there, I think. I mean, like I try to sort of make it visible that if I meet you, for instance, that I have met you before somewhere else. And just Sharali and I talked about it, like how it's important to sort of see that I'm not arriving and I'm meeting everybody for the first time, but you sort of see like, oh, and then I went here with you, and then I saw you over there.
But you hinted at that geography because you talked about trying to get around.
Yes.
And, so, but I You only had the conversation with Jamaican immigration officer, but I'm sure there are many
Yeah.
others.
No, and so I think there is more of that in the book in that way, I think. Um,
I wanted to jump in and say, Sasha, like it's such a practical book, as I think Chris was saying. It's not in the typical book that we get about the Caribbean, which is very theoretic and which definitely serves a great purpose, but it fills that other gap. So it's totally like if I give students, I don't know, one of those other books, they're gonna put it down. But if I give them this book, I think they could start to plan and start to map things out for themselves. And also, like I remember in a conversation you described meeting Tessa Mars in Haiti and how she chose to drive a certain type of car because that's really
Mhm.
practical for her. And I love that way that you get into like the way artists have to really juggle and go around things and navigate differently. But I wanted to find out, like, if I am a teacher, what are the kind of provisions that are there to have it be available for students easily?
Hmm.
well, I mean, I sent you. You can share the EPUB.
Okay.
You could share that with. I mean, by now I'm learning that sending the books over is a total drag, and it costs like a fortune. And I mean, Shareli only now gets them, and they've been in customs, and I send them as a gift, and now she has to pay taxes over it, and I'm like, what? I've put like lists with names, and it's ridiculous. But the EPUB, yeah, you can like I send it to everybody on all these Excel lists, and it's free, but you can actually share it, and it
Okay.
continues to be free.
That's good to know.
Yeah. Yeah, so you can totally do that because I mean it's more about having it out there than me selling books and doing more prints or whatever. It's it's getting the stuff available. Or if you know about somebody from Jamaica who's here and can take some, like
Mm.
Sean was here and he took some through Trinidad. Um,
Well, Sasha, there's a question for you. So I think it
so
would be great to have the audience participate before we come to an end. It says, I would like to ask Sasha in her travels. Do you see the question and
yeah, I'm seeing
conversation?
it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So rather than my read it, which
Um,
islands particularly stand out for having a collaborative art scene?
I think all the islands have that. But if I have to choose one, I think probably Puerto Rico, but that might have been like what we were talking about yesterday, also, Marta, because of the hurricane. So it felt like in Puerto Rico, the people were very much like together and helping each other and going to each other's openings. And yeah, I mean, that was my first time on Puerto Rico. So I don't know how if that was similar before the hurricane because I just went just after. And
I
then
think
they
that
had,
the art scene is very supportive of each other because remember, it's a
yeah,
small island and people know each other at
yeah.
different levels, right?
That's
So,
what I felt. Um, and but in general, I think there is way more collaboration. Even when everybody says there is not, because there's also all the frictions between people. Um, but for instance, Aruba has Elvis Lopez and, what he does. And then, people can be, I don't know, like have frictions with them, but something is happening. And it's the same for Curacao. And there is Alice Yarden scene in Trinidad. And of course, it's in a particular art scene. I think that there is in Jamaica also in a way, and they also all quarreling with each other. But there's also, or not, Onika. I mean, I think Cayman Island has the smallest scene, but they're all grouped together around the gallery. So every island has some organization where I felt, this is interesting. There's always that one person or one organization that seems to get a lot of people together if they have to. What are you
Well, I'd
looking at?
like to ask each one to respond to a thought. What would be the next step in having these conversations, or should we? How do we, going back to Nelson, right? How do we lift what is being done? And how do we support each other in getting it done? I guess that's two questions, yeah? So
Please, can you repeat the question? Sorry.
I said, should we have another conversation, and how do we lift each other in terms of the issues that you were bringing forward, in terms of understanding, making the visibility, expanding, right? The reach of what we are doing amongst each other
I
and amongst the broader community.
I think Sasha make the first step to make a small Bible of the Caribbean. So we know institutions, schools, name references, and I think this is the first mapping. So I think the spin-off in general, not only after being talk about different topics regarding the Caribbean, I think a serious mapping of all the creative industry on the same pattern can be the um, the the safest step to make more initiative resilient. Why? Because it's based on numbers and also in inventaries. So when we can create a collective pattern to get access to all these resources, of course we can be more strong. And the second step also is the cataloging. How we can create a standard cataloging to people get access to each other, independent in any language and any Caribbean island. If it's in the definition of Grand Caribbean, of the definition of Insular Caribbean, or in any definition. So I think the first mapping is done to give an impression to be not only engaged but no responsible institution and an important person to establish a way to mapping the creative sector in the Caribbean. And with all these numbers, not only we can create a permeable idea of resiliencia, but also the ways to support or auto support the creative sector in the Caribbean. So if I have to propose a next step, we have to just decide a next day to be together and keep talking about the specific topics. So I'm very open for that, and I'm completely sure Aruba will be participate in an active way.
Gracias.
I think a lot of the conversations were started before the book, and Sasha's book helps bring them into perspective. I think it does make it easier when it comes to lifting out some resources and facts in a different way than me having to go and look myself and surf online. You know, if people have sites or resources there or have individual conversations, I think it gives a person coming into the not coming into the region, but wanting to participate in this choreography, as Chris has put it, who want to participate in that, choreography. It gives them a step forward that wasn't there before. But I think these conversations have been started. And I think I would like to see how the conversations continue on larger and smaller levels. I mean, I think one of the things I liked most about the book is how Sasha divided it within certain chapters and the topics he chose for each chapter. And there's lots of contacts and people now that I'm reconsidering or wanting to spur up new conversations with after going through the individual chapters. I think so I think there's lots of bigger conversations as far as pooling resources into one area where they can be cited. but then also smaller conversations that should come from the book.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to chime in?
I think I would add that that list, that spreadsheet that Sasha compiled, I don't know how that would happen because that seems really expansive. But if each person could somehow, with this book as a kind of reference, Nelson talked about it and Simon, it's a base which we can now like add to. But also, I'm thinking more about disseminating the information. So it's like, okay, if we have a teacher or we have a curator or, like a administrator, how are they in their scope? How would they implement or use this information for whatever purpose or project it is that they want? And I see that that would be the power of the book if it could get into those hands, local level, and then people develop a purpose on how they're going to use it. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking.
Yeah, so
Sorry.
just said, like, I think all of you have the EPUB and it's totally shareable. So in that sense, that can be done. And I'm also, in terms of books, they're actually coming together tomorrow. I'm donating all the books that I have on the Caribbean and that I got while I'm traveling and around it, all the nonfiction info books around it, to the Contemporary Art Museum in Amsterdam. So it's available for researchers, and they're gonna catalog it and put it in WorldCat, so it's internationally available then.
Oh, great.
Also.
Yeah, I was gonna say that.
And I tried to actually have all these Excel sheets in an open source thing. And then I ran into all these new privacy laws, and it became this whole complicated thing. So but I mean, everybody said yes to the Excel list. So if anybody feels they want to, I mean, you're allowed to, because that was asked of everybody. But yeah, like in Europe, that's not very doable at the moment because of all these laws.
Okay, I think Chris, you were going to jump in.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that there are lots of publications over the years. So I've come to the conclusion that it's just as the islands are kind of potentially fragmented in certain ways in terms of how people move and what they. It would be also interesting to kind of. Well, I've come to the conclusion that the more the merrier. Like, I'm always excited when a new book comes because each book becomes very much about a moment, and it talks about the dynamism of the circumstance. There's been so many Caribbean shows and so many publications, and in the last, let's say, decade compared to the decade before. And so there's quite a lot of material to go over. So, and I think there's been a lot of conversation about what these documents instigate. And one of the values, I think, of Sasha's project is that it does instigate a kind of curiosity to proceed with research. It's like a kind of.
I think that was also one of the. I'm not hearing Chris anymore.
We can't hear you, Chris. You're on mute.
I am.
Yeah.
Oh, now we hear you.
No, what happened? Someone was calling me. I had to get rid of the call.
Oh.
So I'm just saying that the book. What's interesting about the book as a document is that it actually instigates curiosity and research about all the other books that have come out over the years, and about those that are about to come out. I mean, I think the Thames and Hudson is doing
Yeah,
a new
Virle
edition.
is gonna add.
Uh,
That's like I'm
uh,
excited. Yeah,
there's a new version coming,
yeah.
um, and there's 100 other,
Another 30
not in,
years adding to it. That's all of you.
yeah, and all kinds of other things. So like I mean, I've tried. I mean, I think I have um, just about every book going back over the last 30 years. Um, but a lot of it isn't available. Like if I went in the local library here, I wouldn't find one third of those books. I don't know. I saw Annalie was asking a question. I know at Fresh Milk, um, they they have a library that they were cataloging and so on, that she had inherited from a friend who's, gosh, sorry, her name has gone. The library is in her name. Because I think of a lot of the people that are practicing in the region now, I think in terms of being in most of the early shows of this, from say the 80s on, I think it would probably be me and Annalie that might have the most amount of books and catalogs and of different shows and things. I don't know who in Jamaica would have, would have collected some of these things. But these are things talking about the region, all the shows that were curated. I think, things going all the way back to Caribbean Visions or Caribbean Art Now, and even older things. I'm talking about things going all the way back into the 80s. Um, things that included the Anglophone Caribbean. I mean, there are lots of things in the Spanish and French territories. I mean, I think when I was hearing Shirley speak and Nelson speak, my mind went back to when I first returned to the Caribbean, and I think of Ruby Eckmeyer and that unwieldy project called Carabat, which I think was one of the projects that brought that's certainly the context within which I met Elvis Lopez. Um, in the early days, he had just founded Ateliers 89, which I think is probably the oldest kind of pan-Caribbean residency there is, unless there's some in Cuba or in in the Spanish territories that I've not heard of.
Well, as
So
we come,
there's a lot good, these documents.
so thank you for that. Shani, you want to say
Yeah.
something because we're coming to a close?
Okay. Yeah. No. I think for me, if what is the next step, for me, if I look at the responsibility of us as an individual and not underestimating what you can do, so that is across the message constantly, because I really believe in the step by step and not looking back. So since I met, from my own initiatives to being able to attend to Caribbean Linked, or having met Chris, or having to know that there is a Onika, I mean, and try to really always include and think not for your own practice, but think in a broader and larger scale. And one of the examples, since then I could not only contribute to a program without naming other fellow artists for exhibitions,
Mm.
because I knew that if people knew that there are more of us, more could happen. And also that what has been a what can we do with our own resources? In my case, I think there is a question that came in, really including if these conversations, initiating also these conversations. But if I am able to get some funding, how can I also not only think of the Dutch Caribbean, but expand it larger and always include other regions, other speaking, because we speak four here. We speak four languages. So if I think of our resources, it makes more logical sense, as if even if I have to moderate, for me to include a Spanish speaking artist or institution and an English one. And even if if and then we can code switch, or even abandoning, in my institution I don't like, or in the organization, I don't really stick to one language. That is not an important asset for me to have a correct language. The communication is important, that there is the information out there, or that the event actually happens, or that there is a program happening. So putting priorities, and that's all in my own, without having to negotiate it. So I think there's a lot as individuals that we can do. And it's also about, I think I learned also, I think from Sasha and others, that by asking, by having, it's okay to have a conversation. So when I am asked, in my position coming from my Caribbean background, I make sure to ask a message around. And some of you that Chris, not less, and Sasha, and I think Annalie also, I'm asking, hey Onika, do you know anybody, because they're looking for this and this and that. And then I make sure to draft that Excel sheet that I learned, that Sasha said you can just share information. So those are, each one of those are steps that we all can do, and then you see that will kind of automatically, it will happen just enough for the other generations, and for the other one two on each island, that will maybe pick up on it and move further. Because if
Thank
I
you.
go, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't mean to cut you off, but we are running over time, so I want to be respectful of people's time. Sasha, some closing words. You have a whole bunch more to do. We're not hearing you. We're not hearing you.
No, I said it's in the middle of the night here. I can just talk and then I log off and roll into my bed next to my computer. So this was the question. What comes now next?
No, I'm just
I think
saying. Everybody gave you a lot of suggestions about what's next. So
I think for me the most important thing is what Chris was saying. I'm really hoping that the book instigates stuff, anything, for new students to do a PhD in the Caribbean in all kind of fields. Like maybe you think you're an economy student and you think like, hey, I want to do something, write more, document more. In that sense, I'm with Chris. I think there should be way more documentation. There cannot be enough in different fields, in different slides of times, and so that I really hope, and that that projects come out of it, that exhibitions come out of it, that people outside the region think, hey, if we do something about the Caribbean, maybe we should actually not ask our diaspora artists, but actual artists from the Caribbean. We should maybe ask a curator from the Caribbean. I'm trying, like Onika actually wrote an essay for the Contemporary Art Museum here in Holland. Like I made those lists and approached the museums and said, like, these are writers that you can ask to write essays to. So yeah.
Well, I would love to think of a joint project on behalf of the Creative Justice Initiative and Corredor Afro. So let's keep talking. Thank you so much, all of you, for participating in this conversation. And it won't be the last conversation, hopefully, that we will have. But Sasha, thank you so very much for the work that you have done and have brought us together.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for bringing us together.
Thank you all very much for having me around in the region and spending time with me and sharing your knowledge and experiences.
So there's still some more questions for you, but even if we're offline, you can access those questions. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you all. Buenas noches. Bonne nuit.
Bye.
So how do I